Good evening. I'd like to call to order the City of Lakewood City Council regular meeting on August 14th, 2017 at 7 p.m. in council chambers. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Hall.
Here.
Coop.
Here.
Wickman. Gutwein. Here. Franks. Harrison. Here. Roybal.
Here.
Vincent.
Here.
Abel.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Shakti.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Great, thank you. I'd like to welcome everybody for coming out and joining us tonight. And for those tuning in online or potentially on Channel 8, we welcome you. And if you do have a cell phone in chambers, if you could put that on silent, that'd be fantastic, even up here. So before we move on to the Pledge of Allegiance and we have some special guests, I just want to take a quick second and talk a little bit to the community about some of the events that happened over the weekend. And I tried to write a statement, but I guess it just really didn't make sense. So I just want to talk a little bit from my heart. And, we have a lot of problems, and we're very blessed that we can come to this forum and have civil discourse and talk about development issues, infrastructure issues. But if you dig a little bit deeper, our country and our world has a lot of deep, deep problems. And we see it manifest itself over and over again. And for my generation, we had the opportunity to read about a lot of this stuff in the history books. Our parents or grandparents fought in World War II, and they fought for a reason, and that reason was to stop the ugliness that we saw manifest again on Saturday. So I just want to say to this community that I can speak as a leader that we're not perfect. Some of that does exist, but we're a welcoming community, one that says we're building an inclusive community on our signs. And I believe that we stand by that, and that whenever or wherever we see something like that take place, we'll fight with our full force to make sure. One of the things I learned through my history books is, for some reason, and not to cast doubt or shame or judge, people sat silent. And next thing you know, millions of people were killed. And so it's time that we have a voice, and we make sure that our voice is heard. So I just wanted to just mention that tonight, and stand up for all that's right and all that's great about our country. And we're an example of that tonight, and Lakewood, Colorado is an example of that. We're going to continue to shine bright. So with that, Ms. Shakti.
Mayor, would it be appropriate for me to make a statement to
Certainly.
it?
Anybody on council may.
Thank you for those words. I wrote a statement. Clarence Anthony, the executive director of the National League of Cities, said, "The violence was like salt rubbed in wounds endured over generations." He went on to say that we have a long way to go on the long and difficult road of racial healing. People are capable of great beauty, but also of being horrible. The violent act and the increasing number of racist comments and assaults reminds me that as elected officials, part of our role is to lead, to help in our collective effort to overcome weakness and to aim for higher ideals like kindness. I want to live in a world where as a society we foster everyone's potential for greatness. That will not come from hatred, fear, or violence, but from having an open heart and working together.
Thank you. Council President Roybal.
Thank you, Bear. I echo the same sentiments. This is a beautiful city. I love this city. I respect this city. Everybody here in the diocese loves this city and respects it. That's why we're here. We're here to serve. I grew up in the 60s, and yes, I got a lot of negativity through growing up. And one of the positive things is you adapt and you overcome. And one of the huge things that Martin Luther King said is we're gonna win this battle, and we just keep marching forward and we keep moving forward. But I'm here to say that I don't know of council because I can't speak on their behalf, but I will not tolerate any of that here in the city. I will take it to toe. And I just wanted to let it be known and put it out there. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you, sir. All right. So with that, we have some special guests with us, and we'd love to have them come down and introduce themselves and lead us in the pledge after they introduce and tell us where they're from. I can tell you they're from Troop 808, coming out on probably one of their last summer nights. You can just jump right up here to that mic, and if you want to introduce yourself.
My name is Tobin Price. I'm a senior at Lakewood High School.
Hello, my name is Koji Inoue, and I am at Bear Creek K-8.
My name is Ulysses Hendershot, and I go to the American School of Dubai.
My name is Johnny Campbell, and I go to Dunstan Middle School.
All right.
I am Brendan Fitzgerald, and I go to Green Mountain High School.
I'm Leif Clickham, and I go to Dunstan Middle School.
I am Alan Palazzi, and I go to Green Mountain High School.
I am Jackson Davis, and I go to Alameda International High School.
I'm Dave Palazzi. I'm the acting committee chair for Troop 808.
And I'm Mark Campbell, and I'm an assistant scoutmaster for Troop 808.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. If you'd all please rise, and these fine gentlemen will lead us, and please remain standing for a moment of silent prayer.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Please be seated. All right, first up we have public comment. This is the point in the meeting where the public is invited to address the City Council on items that did not appear on the agenda. All comments should be directed to the City Council. I ask that all in attendance observe the decorum of chambers. I don't think that'll be a problem. We'll have 3 minutes, and this little black box up here will go green. When your 2.5 minutes is up, it'll go yellow. And when your time is up, it'll go red. And there's 3 folks that have signed up. And keep in mind, if you would like to speak on any of the other agenda items, you'll have that opportunity as well. First up is Mr. Chisholm. Good evening.
Can you hear me okay?
A little bit closer.
Like this? You can hear me?
That's great.
City Council, Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, greetings. My name is Jay Chisholm. I am the property owner at 1595 Carr Street, Lakewood, Colorado. We recently received this letter from the Public Works Department. It says here that the wall is, oh yes, it says here, if the wall is not torn down, the city will start enforcement action regarding encroachment into the floodway. I want to make it clear that my quarrel is not with the building department. They do not have any problem with my wall. My quarrel is with the Public Works Department. They are communist land thieves. This is the wall in question. I'm a civil engineer and have studied the ordinance and the map given me by the city. I wrote the city a letter stating that the wall does not encroach into the floodway. The city engineer said, "You are the property owner. I do not believe you." I spent several $1,000s hiring a civil engineer and surveyor to do a report and design showing that the wall does not encroach into the floodway and that the ordinance was met. The city engineer, in turn, spent several $1,000s of sales tax money to produce a report and a new map to show that the wall encroaches into the floodway. In other words, she had to change the rules of the game because she lost. I am the owner of this land, and this is private property. The city does not own this land. The city is going to come onto my land with heavy equipment and do damage to my private property in tearing out this wall. This week, I am contacting investigative reporter Jesse Paul with the Denver Post. I will give him a transcript of this speech and other information about this communist land grab. I will fight you in the newspaper. I will fight you on the radio. I will fight you on the TV. I will never give up until my wall is built. My wife and I are senior citizens on a fixed income, victims of crime, and fighting for our economic lives against a communist city government with an unlimited amount of sales tax money to victimize us with. Is this how the citizens of Lakewood want their sales tax money spent? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Mace. Good evening.
Good evening, Mayor, City Council members. I'm here tonight, and I know that this is up for study next week, but I'm here tonight to urge the City Council not only to take care of the grocery cart issue, but also to include Belmar Library. I have been pulling grocery carts back from the Belmar Library for months now, and I am quite tired of doing it. I am urging the City Council, after the study session, to start implementing fines to the library. I understand that the council cannot implement them while they're on the bus at the bus stop, but they can implement them at the library. This is crazy. I've done enough. I've even personally warned Belmar. I don't want to see him get a fine, but this is outlandishly stupid, if you ask me. I'm tired of pulling carts back because every day that I go over there, I see more carts. And the other thing that I want to talk to you guys about is any issues with anybody going into cardiac arrest or anything like that. I am CPR and first aid certified, so if the city needs help, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mace. Mr. Johnson? Good evening, welcome.
Thank you. That's a tough one to follow. It's kind of gut-wrenching. Dave Johnson. I live in Green Mountain Estates. I've been a citizen in that area for 53 years. I was there right around when it was built, and to me, it is the only safe haven that I have anymore, is to go home. I don't care what time of day. The traffic is horrendous. And what are we doing about our infrastructure? We're totally overlooking it. And, you know, the gentleman with the carts and whatnot, you can see why he has a legitimate concern. And you got to get a handle on that. But what about our automobiles on the road? And the safety of our general public, and our children, and the schools, and building apartment complexes so close to our schools and whatnot. What about that? You know, we're building all these humongous apartments and condos, and I call them high-rises anymore. They're so big. That one by Wendy's down there is startling, and it's an eyesore. I'm sorry. We made a big mistake and didn't really follow up on that one. I'm proud of this city. I'm proud of our police department and our fire department. I can't say enough good about them, and I never will say anything bad about them. They've always been there for me. But I don't feel like, as a council, and Mayor, I have to address you and single you out in a lot of ways, because I think you have not listened to a lot of people who have been trying to put forth and understand what is going on in this city that is an all-inclusive community. I love Lakewood. People come here to visit from out of state. They marvel at it. But I'm sure glad I'm in Green Mountain Estates, where we can get away from it all and drive off a very busy Alameda, which used to be, could handle the traffic and whatnot. We don't have enough grocery stores. King Soopers down there, you go down there and how long you got to wait? It's incredible anymore. Safeway isn't even fixing up their store. You think they'd be more than happy to put something in. And we're talking out at Rooney Valley out there. I don't see any grocery stores in the plans for that. XL can't even supply the power necessary for that community down there. I'm at a loss for words. I'm sorry, but this is my third council meeting, and the only second time I've spoken. But I'm sure I speak on behalf of a lot of citizens. And thank you for your time and your effort.
Thank you, sir. All right, that exhausts the roster. Anybody else? All right. Natalie, did you? Ms. Menton? Director Menton tonight? All right. RTD Board Director Menton.
Thank you very much. I'll start to explain about some service changes proposed that are coming up. And right now we've just started the process on this. So as a reminder, RTD changes schedules 3 times a year. January, May, August. These changes that we are looking at right now would take effect in January if it's passed by the board. Normally I don't come to you with all the things we just regularly do, and if there's nothing substantial, I don't take your time on that. But I think in this set of service changes, it warrants coming to you and just bringing to your attention a couple items that you can pass on. Specifically, the W line is the one that would be most affected by the proposed changes. And what is generating this proposal is the ridership with the W line. The W line is still not performing as well as we need it to. And so the proposal here does 2 different things. One is on, once you get all the copies and you look at the front page, it has a diagram of the system. You're going to see that on the part from the Federal Center out to Jefferson County Government Center, so just that last, or well, that's actually technically the beginning, but that section out there from Jeffco Government Center to the Federal Center, during the off-peak hours, so off-peak would mean between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m., and 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. on, would now be going from, instead of the 15-minute service, to a 30-minute service. That's a portion of the line. Truly out there, really, one of the more common comments I get is a train is always empty when I see it go by. And I hear that from people who even work at Jeffco Government Center, and they're sitting there and they see it. So that's the weak part of the line. So the proposal is, again, reducing that to 30-minute service during the off-peak hours, and then all day, Saturdays and Sundays. So I think I'm going to bring back some more details on a variety of things here, but that one right there is one to watch for. The other is the last trip, except for Fridays and Saturdays, The last trip right now goes out at about 1 a.m. This would eliminate that last trip on multiple lines, not just the W line. So where you see D, E, H, and W, all of them would be eliminating that late night trip, except for the Friday, Saturday, because that's more traffic downtown where people are using it. Ridership drives a lot of this, but also it's tightening the belt. So I don't know how I am on time here.
You're fine.
Okay. Of interest here, too, I'll just point out, and it's in the packet I gave you there, is in the section where it's got the two W lines just highlighted, not the map, but where it's detailing what these changes are. You'll notice on the R line, we just opened that line in Aurora in February, and that line is performing very, very badly. So even though it's brand new, half of it is proposed to be the R2 lines are going next to each other right there, parallel. This would take the new line, and half of it would not operate during the off-peak hours at all, and it would transfer the other line. So people using that system are now making two transfers. If you look at the savings right there, that will save $2.8 million. But again, what's really driving it on the R line is the boardings. I'm going to give you just a couple numbers. Our line right now has 42 boardings per hour, and that's bad. That's real bad. 42 boardings per hour. The W line is still not great, but right now you're sitting closer to about, let's say, 100, 110, 120 right in there. We want to get this up to 150. So that's why we're hoping to increase the efficiency. And that means the fewer trips, and it might be some more people, but we're not really seeing the crowding that I'm concerned about. In your packet, you'll notice two other items. Specifically, Route 3, bus stop consolidations, along with some others in the district. For my district, Wheat Ridge, those also might be facing minor changes. Anyway, it says stop. So what I'm just hoping that you'll do is get this into your, your thought process right now. And then I'm going to be bringing you more information probably in a couple weeks. And I'll have all the details. We will have one public hearing out here in Lakewood or Golden. And that will be probably later September. And by then I'll have firm details that you can pass along.
Director Minton, there's a question or two. Would you be willing to answer?
Sure. Yes.
Council President, or Mayor Pro Tem Harrison.
I see it in the report here, Director Minton, but I was just going to ask you so that people that are listening, what would be the last trip on the W line then? It looks like it would be 12 o'clock.
12 a.m., just right after that.
Okay, so. Thank you.
Councilor Vincent?
Yes. Has there been any work done, because I don't have any data except for what people say, that every time you change the schedule, that they have to reduce their ridership or they can't take the train anymore because especially in the morning and the evenings, they have to be somewhere at a certain time. So when you elongate those stops, they can't take it anymore, or they have to get up another 45 minutes early, and they're not going to do that. Mm-hmm. Do you collect any numbers around that?
I would have to say it's been studied many, many times. It's the same as changing fares. How does it change someone's behavior? And it's hard to say that if we kept it at the times it's at now, that loss in ridership, I don't think it's going to make up for how inefficient it's running right now, how inefficiently it's running.
Okay, so frequency doesn't have anything to do?
No, I do believe it drives ridership. I believe that's why we face a problem on the W line. The W line in many ways acts like a trolley. It's not real fast. All of those decisions play into the ridership of a system. If a train takes you X amount of time and you can drive sooner, then you're just going to drive. So it ties right into what you're asking about frequency. And if they don't want to give up that extra half hour or 30 minutes wherever they're getting on the line, then that is a trade-off people do make. Can I give you firm numbers on what you're asking? No.
No. Okay. No. Thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else? Thank you, Director Minton.
You're welcome. Thanks for the extra time. I'll be coming back soon.
All right, move on to the consent agenda. The consent agenda has been made to expedite council action. It contains both resolutions and first reading ordinances. Resolutions are items of routine nature. Members of the public will have an opportunity in a moment to comment on any of the proposed resolutions. First reading ordinances appear on the agenda only for the purpose of setting future public hearing dates and ordering the newspaper publication of the proposed ordinance. No public comment will be heard this evening on first reading ordinances. The public will have the opportunity to comment on the proposed ordinances during the scheduled public hearings on the date set tonight by City Council. Any council member may request an item on the consent agenda be removed for separate discussion under general business. Will the clerk please read the consent agenda?
The consent agenda consists of items 5 through 11 inclusive. Item 5, Resolution 2017-26, approving participation by the City of Lakewood in a coordinated election to be conducted on November 7th, 2017 by the Jefferson County Clerk and Recorder. Item 6, Resolution 2017-27, authorizing the acquisition of the Kelly property for open space and/or public park purposes. Item 7, Ordinance 2017-10, authorizing execution of a permanent easement to the Sheridan Station West Metropolitan District for drainage and related facilities across municipal property at West 11th Avenue and Depew Street, Lakewood, Colorado. Item 8, Ordinance 2017-11, authorizing repairs on or replacement of city property damaged as a result of the May 8, 2017 hailstorm, including supplemental appropriation to the 2017 original budget. Item 9, Ordinance 2017-12, amending Chapter 5.38 of the Lakewood Municipal Code to eliminate the prohibition on the issuance of hotel and restaurant liquor licenses to establishments located within 500 feet of a school. Item 10, approving the minutes of the City Council meetings of June 12th and July 24th, both 2017. And Item 11, accepting the minutes of the Board of Appeals meeting of July 11th, 2017.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to now open the public hearing on resolutions 26 and 27. Nobody's signed up to speak. Seeing none, I'll close that. 26 just is getting us ready for the November 7th election with Jefferson County. And then the item number 6, 17-27, is really cool. And unfortunately, our city manager is not here tonight, so I know she was around when this whole thing started, but this is the final acquisition of Green Mountain, and we've been paying for 30 years. So tonight we will finalize the ownership of all the open space in Green Mountain. Cool. With that, I'll gladly accept a motion.
Mayor Paul, I move for the approval of the council minutes, for acceptance of the minutes of boards and commissions, order all ordinances introduced on the first reading to be published in the Denver Post, with public hearings set for the date included in the ordinance, and for the adoption of resolution of all which are included in the consent agenda items introduced into record by the city clerk.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Councilor Johnson.
Thank you. I just have a few questions. On page 34 of our agenda, under the request or the authorizing money for hail damage, summary and background of subject matter, there's something there that I just need to understand a little better. It's in the first paragraph there. It says, it's talking about insurance money, and it says, if additional funds beyond those requested in the ordinance are needed, staff will bring another request to council. But if the total cost is less than the amounts appropriated by the ordinance, any remaining funds can be reappropriated for other purposes. Please tell me, how will that happen? And how will that be reappropriated? And if we're talking insurance money, it's not clear to me, because originally this paragraph was speaking to insurance. if insurance money isn't spent, and there's still some left, I just need to understand that better, please.
We have the Director of Employee Relations, Jeff Dolan.
Welcome, Mr. Dolan.
Mayor and Council. The money that we receive back from our insurance company goes into our general fund, and all we're doing is pulling that money out, setting it aside so that we can use that money to dedicate towards the repairs to our buildings and rolling stock. So if we end up getting really good pricing and we don't end up having to spend the full amount, the balance of that money returns from the risk fund back to the general fund.
But it was insurance money?
Yeah, we will be getting a series of checks coming in over time as we work with the insurance company. They'll give us money to say, here's money for replacing these buildings and these pieces of equipment. Because of some of the cost of materials and some of those kind of variables that we don't necessarily control, we've estimated costs. We've had initial estimates from the insurance company, and so a lot of that is us presuming that we'll be able to get work done in a certain period of time. So we're assuming that we'll have some extra cash at the end that will return to the general fund, but we want to make sure that we don't end up too short.
If it's insurance money and we've been overpaid, how does that work?
No, it's a great question, Counselor. We will rarely be overpaid from the insurance company.
Well, it just didn't sound like it from this. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, we estimate the initial cost is minus the depreciation. So if a vehicle costs $30,000 to replace, and we're able to, and the insurance companies gives us that $30,000 up front, if we can replace that or fix that vehicle for under that, the difference of that is our money. It would go back to the general fund.
Okay. Actually, that leads me to another question. This is kind of unfamiliar territory to me. I don't know how many of our vehicles are very aged, and if we are we going to replace them or fix them, or should they be replaced if they're very old? Please talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I'll give you a little context. After the hailstorm, we had 90 of our vehicles that were damaged. And that damage ranged from minor dimples, like you would see, all the way up to complete and total destruction of a vehicle. The insurance company came out with an adjuster. They looked at all of our rolling stock, any of our vehicles, and they gave us an estimate of what it would cost to fix. There are certain pieces of our equipment that we own, perhaps if it was 10 years old, the value of that vehicle to fix it was greater than the value of the vehicle to basically to total it out. And so the insurance company works with us in risk management to try to figure out for each one of those pieces of equipment where that threshold is. Many of our vehicles were damaged to a point where we had to do immediate repairs on them. Many of our police cruisers had damage to the lights, damage to the windshield, so we were unable to operate them. So we did work with Travelers to get those back up and running right away. And so really the work that needs to be done on those vehicles tends to be more cosmetic at this point. So we do try to work to find that balance with the insurance company. With 90 vehicles, though, it's this love-hate relationship where we go back and forth with them to assume, here's what we think the value is, here's what they think the value is. So we have great partners with Travelers, but it is something that it's just a process that we go through.
Okay, let's see. I had another question. It's on page 40, and it's under the ordinance that's dealing with the municipal code regarding the liquor. Let's see here.
So if we might, we should probably pull these under general business since we're just setting the public hearing.
Okay.
If that's okay.
I just had a few questions about
Mr. Dolan, though, before, so let's finish the insurance, because I think, never mind, her light went off. There was another insurance question.
Enough.
So, is there any more insurance? Okay. Councilor Johnson, you said you just have a couple questions about the liquor?
Yeah, there's one place in here it was talking about a public hearing regarding the liquor, and I was just wondering, what is the length of that process? Does anybody have an idea on that?
That'd be the city clerk, Ms. Greer.
I apologize. The length of the process so that this ordinance is effective? Is that what the effective date?
Well, it's talking about a public hearing, and Margie, I'm trying to find the right whereas, and I should have listed it.
Let's wait. We have a motion.
Well, I'm not finding the language right
Councilwoman
now.
Johnson, the only place I think that we refer to the public hearing is in the attestation, the very last paragraph on the ordinance.
Okay.
And so all it's saying is that today you're asking me on first reading to set that public hearing date for 2 weeks out.
Mhm.
And then the ordinance becomes effective 30 days after final
that.
publication, which is 30 days from the Thursday following the second public hearing.
I just wanted to make that clear publicly.
Absolutely.
And then on page 50, under minutes, we're talking here about the proposed motion for the moratorium. And okay, under my comments here, it says that I stated the moratorium was to stop high density, high profile. It would not affect residential or commercial. And that is true, but it was to stop it in order to look at our zoning ordinance. That was the issue, is to have time to look at the language in our zoning ordinance. And I would like to have that reflected in the minutes if I could, because I think that this gives a bad misconception about what I was trying to do. And I believe it was stated that night.
Would you mind telling me which set of minutes you're looking at, June 12th or June?
I am on page 50 under my comments. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going by pages. Okay. Yeah, June 12th, page 9. I think that there was...
If it's okay, let me go back and listen to the tape and understand it, and I'll bring these back for revision, so we could pull these from the consent agenda.
That would be helpful. There was misconception out there, and it was basically to try and get the zoning ordinance to look at language. That was the whole crux of it. This doesn't sound that way. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Certainly.
So, Mr. Cox, that we have a motion and a second. We need to remove. So, do we need to start over, or can that just be amended? How would you like us to proceed?
Well, you know, when we talk about minutes getting approved, that is one of the most ministerial functions that council has. It's one of the few places where you have some flexibility, even for someone to vote on approval when they weren't there, if they get assurances from their fellow council members. So I think we could probably ask the maker of the motion to just reiterate that is the motion is being made without, as amended, without that item number included, and then the second can follow.
Thank you, Council President.
Okay.
Ribble?
I would like to make a motion to amend to remove items. Which one is that?
Just remove City Council meetings June 12th, 2017.
City Council meetings June 12th,
2017.
2017.
Second.
All right. So now we're back up to motion and a second. Any more comments? Councilor Gutwein.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I'm thankful for the foresight of our city and our citizens in preserving Green Mountain, and I think it's exciting that we will finish purchasing and preserving that space for years to come so that everyone can enjoy it. So,
great.
Thanks.
All right. Well, with that, I ask that you please cast your votes. And the consent agenda passes 11 ayes, 0 nays. Thank you. All right, next up is general business. We have a discussion tonight that's going to focus on parking requirements. And this is kind of the first stage of some of the things that we're going to start to look at as we move forward. And I will invite our planning director, Travis Parker, up. Good evening.
Good evening, Travis Parker. Good evening, Mayor, Council. Tonight I'm here to talk specifically about multifamily parking. We've had a lot of discussion in the past few weeks about updating the zoning code. At your meeting last week, you gave control to the Planning Commission on creating that public process. We'll be starting that process very soon. We've noticed a meeting on August 23rd to talk with the Planning Commission about creating the process with open houses and public meetings around all of these issues. Prior to last week's meeting, though, you had already asked for this discussion about multifamily residential parking requirements. So I'm here to talk about that tonight. It's not part of my presentation, but I know there are questions and an interest in discussing other parking aspects. So I'm happy to chat about restaurant, retail, other parking issues. But all of that, regardless of what we talk about tonight, will be part of what the Planning Commission looks at over the next few weeks and months. So really have three areas I want to talk about tonight. First, I'm going to get into what the existing regulations are in our current zoning code on multifamily residential. Secondly, I want to talk about buildings that have been built under that code and what we've seen happen in the last 4.5 years. And finally, I want to do a case study and talk about one building in particular and parking counts and how the parking is actually working in that building, and talk about counting additional buildings in the future. So when the code was written in 2012, we looked at a lot of data, both through Colorado and nationally, about how parking works and how parking counts work and how parking is utilized in different cities. This chart here is an example of the kind of data that we use. This particular chart is a count of cities throughout the northwestern United States and how parking is provided, how parking is used. We looked at similar charts from around the country and around the state. We learned a number of things from this information. First, we learned that the provision and use of parking is very contextual. You'll notice in this chart that parking counts are a lot lower in a downtown area, that's that central business district number, than they are in an urban or especially in a suburban area. This was one of the data points that we used in the new code in actually creating different rules for different contexts. A number of data points went into making that decision, but this was one of them. And we actually used those different contexts to separate out our parking maximums, as you'll see soon. The second thing we learned from charts like this is that while there are always exceptions, you can always find a building in a city that was underparked, that doesn't have enough parking. The rule is, the standard is, parking is overbuilt. You can see in this chart, in northwestern cities, the average downtown residential building is parked at 0.8 spaces per unit, or is built at 0.8 spaces per unit and is parked around 0.6 spaces per unit. In suburban areas, the average building is built at 1.6 spaces per unit and parked at 1.2. There's a bunch of reasons for this. We looked into this at the time. Largely, the reason that this happens is residential property developers are building a product that they have to sell or lease. And it's hard to sell or lease your product if it's underparked. And this especially becomes important because buildings are not built for cash. These buildings are built with borrowed money. And the people that lend money to build residential buildings have a lot of strict requirements about parking and how much parking they require for these buildings. So the general rule is residential buildings are overparked and built for more parking than they actually use. So that's the second thing that we learned back in 2012. The third thing that we learned from a lot of this research was that the general trend over the last 30 or 40 years is downward in terms of the actual use of parking. The use of parking in today's residential buildings is not significantly but slightly lower than it was 10 years ago, and it was lower 10 years ago than it was 30 years ago. So we looked at the 80s and 90s as the high water mark in the provision and the use of parking in residential buildings, and we're at slightly lower numbers than we were back then. So all of this information went into the creation of our parking requirements in 2012. And we started with creation of a minimum requirement. Now, as you all know, our minimum requirement for residential, for multifamily residential in Lakewood is 0.75 spaces per unit. That equates to 3 spaces for every 4 units. This does not mean that this is an appropriate ratio for every building in the city of Lakewood. This is the minimum. What this means is that there are locations, there are situations where this is an appropriate number in Lakewood. We have areas of town next to light rail and with certain populations of residents that this ratio works. It is not appropriate in every building. It's not appropriate, especially in areas that aren't as transit friendly. And that's why, this was set as a minimum to allow it where it's appropriate, but not necessarily to encourage it where it's not. With minimums, we also set maximums. These didn't exist prior to 2012, but as we saw in the previous slide, the overall trend of parking is slightly downward, and parking is generally overbuilt in residential as a result of market forces. So this is where we divided out our requirements by context. In the suburban context, these are areas of our city that are auto-oriented. They're not near transit. They're not necessarily walkable to services or anything else. People need to use their cars in order to live in these places. We set that maximum high. We set it at 3 spaces per condo or apartment building, or condo or apartment unit. In the urban context, which is our middle-of-the-road context, this is a context designed for both auto and pedestrian. We want the context to be friendly to both modes of transit. We set it at a more middle rate of 2 spaces per condo or apartment unit. And then finally in transit, these are our areas immediately adjacent to our light rail stations. These are our areas that are either walkable now or are intended and designed to be walkable. And the idea of the maximum here is to avoid suburban-style, auto-oriented projects in those areas of our community. And so the maximum there was set at 1.5 spaces per unit. And so to show this in another way, this graph shows the ranges that were created for each of these contexts, with transit being narrower, 0.75 to 1.5, and working its way up to suburban, which has a very wide range of potential parking ratios. At the time, we looked at other ways of doing this. There are other ways that we could have organized this, and other ways that we can and will look at again in this new process, and I want to show you a couple of them here. Another way that we can look at doing these ranges is to not only vary the maximum by context, but to vary the minimum by context, and to raise the minimum in urban and suburban to higher numbers to indicate that, we don't want to allow a 0.75 or even maybe a 0.1 in a suburban area of town. One of the reasons that was discussed back in 2012 for not doing a system like this, for just having a general parking minimum, has to do with different types of buildings, of residential buildings that are built. The idea being the proximity to transit isn't the only variable in parking. There are other variables in the decision on a parking ratio. One variable is the type of population the building is serving. So buildings that are designed for independent living, for example, for retirees coming out of their suburban home and moving into a different environment, have lower parking usage. Buildings for group residential facilities, for particular types of people facing particular challenges, generally have lower parking needs. So the idea in not choosing this type of a chart was that even in the suburban and the auto-oriented areas, there are types of buildings that sometimes are appropriate to be parked at a lower ratio. And the thought being at the time, the market does a pretty good job of providing what is needed. Sometimes they provide a lot more. Another option that was looked at, and again will be looked at again in our new process, is maybe creating an overall higher ratio, something like 1 or 1.25 spaces per unit, and then providing administrative flexibility to go below that. So your minimum would be 1, but it could be lowered if you are within so many feet of a transit station, or if you are building a building for independent living, something like along those lines. This is a perfectly reasonable and usable option. The reason we didn't go with this at the time was, contrary to the belief of some in the community, that the current code was designed to minimize administrative flexibility. A system like this would put that decision to lower. It would provide criteria for that decision, but would put that responsibility in the hands of staff. And so we actually made a conscious decision to minimize the opportunities for that in the new code, but it's certainly an option that we looked at the time and that we could look at again. So this is where we ended up, and this is where the code is now with these ranges from 0.75 all the way up to 3 in suburban. And now I want to switch gears and talk about what was built in the last 4.5 years. So this code was passed in 2012, the end of 2012. So the projects that we're going to look at in the next 3 slides are multifamily projects that were built in Lakewood from the beginning of 2013 through today. And I'm going to do it by context. We're going to start with the suburban context. And each of these slides will show the number of dwelling units, the number of parking spaces built, and the ultimate ratio that the buildings were built. They're in chronological order, so no particular order in terms of number of units or anything. But in the suburban context, you'll recall we have a very wide range of potential parking ratio, all the way from 0.75 up to 0.3. What we found in the suburban context is a very narrow range. They're built from just under 1.5. You see the small building there from 1.44 up to just over 2. And a pattern I want you to notice on this slide that we'll see throughout the slides and is another sort of variable in the parking ratio is the size of the building. Often you will see in the coming slides that the larger buildings have larger ratios and the smaller buildings have smaller ratios. There's a couple things that I think go into that. First, smaller buildings often have smaller lots, are more space constrained, but I think more importantly, the smaller buildings, the buildings of 20 or 40 units are better able to manage their parking demand and parking supply than the buildings of hundreds of units. So they are better able to efficiently use their parking than the larger buildings. So in this chart, you'll notice that the larger the building is, the larger the ratio is. Going on to the urban contents, we had 11 projects in the urban context that were built in the last 4.5 years. And here you'll notice the same grouping, the same narrow grouping of ratios, but at a lower number. So the range here is from 0.9 spaces per unit all the way up to just under 1.5 to 0.47. So from about 1 to about 1.5 spaces per unit in the urban context. And then finally, transit, we have the fewest data points, only 2 projects in the transit zone, and the smallest range from 0.75 to 0.15, but we've got, as you can see, a very small project that was built at a low ratio, 0.8, and again, you'll see a much bigger project built at a much bigger ratio, 1.3. So not the same amount of data here to draw as many conclusions from. But what I've done here on this next slide is I've got those same ranges, permissible ranges in each of the zone, and underneath I've added a line for what was actually built, the range of what was actually built. Setting aside the transit, because again, we only have those 2 data points, looking at the urban and suburban, what you'll notice is a tight clustering of 1 to 1.5 in urban, 1.5 to 2 in suburban. And there was nothing in our code that led to this grouping, right? None of these numbers really push up against the minimums. None of these really push up against the maximums. These were market-driven groupings. You can see that the market is building within a certain range in auto-oriented areas and within a different range in our urban areas. Transit, we can't draw the conclusions yet, but I imagine with more data points, we'll see a range that's similar to or slightly lower than the urban. So that concludes the portion of the presentation about what we've seen. I want to end with one particular building and how it's actually being used. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the new apartment building at 35 Van Gordon. This is a 267-unit building that was recently completed. It's got 443 parking spaces, so it's got a parking ratio of 1 2/3 spaces per unit. To put that another way, that's 5 spaces for every 3 units. So the building's still not quite full, but as of the middle of May, there were 176 units occupied in that building. At that time, when there were 176 units occupied, Public Works staff went out and did counts, a series of counts of the actual parking usage of this building, and they found some really interesting numbers, at least interesting to me. First, they counted at nighttime, and nighttime is when residential building parking is full. That's when people are home. And what they found is with 176 units occupied, there were only 160 occupied parking spaces at night, which means the actual usage ratio of this building is 0.91 spaces. To put it another way, nearly 10% of the people occupying that building on May 17th didn't have cars. If this ratio carries out through the build out of the building, that means the parking garage was overbuilt by exactly 200 parking spaces. And they will have 200 extra parking spaces in that building. The other information that they collected on May 17th was even more interesting. May 17th is a weekday, and they also counted during the day, during the workday. In the middle of the day, on May 17th, they counted 112 cars in that parking lot. In other words, 112 or 64% of the people living in that building don't drive to work. So these are 112 people that walk within the neighborhood to their jobs. Now, the Union Corridor didn't add 112 jobs in May. So these are people that prior to this building being there, drove to work, drove to their jobs, and after the provision of this building, now walk to work. To put it another way, by adding units, counterintuitively, there are 112 less rush hour cars on the road. The idea here is, and something that we talked about back in the creation of the new code, we have areas of town that are employment heavy, but without housing. And so the people in those areas have to drive to work. When we balance those numbers, when we provide housing in areas that are employment heavy and come closer to balancing the number of jobs and housing, we can actually reduce the need for cars. I know it's counterintuitive to say add apartments, fewer cars, but this is what we're noticing, what we're actually measuring here at this Van Gordon building. We're going to do more of these counts in the coming months. We will do counts at as many of these buildings as I presented that we can. We'll provide that information in the public sessions to the Planning Commission and to you, and we'll have a lot more information ultimately to make some decisions from in the coming months. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Parker. Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate this first kind of blush on this set of parking. And there's a lot to grasp, and I think again, this tonight was just a nice informational opportunity for us to begin to really start to think about questions as we move forward and look at changing and things along those lines. So I'm going to start with Councilor Koop.
Very, very interesting numbers. I don't know if this is just a question or if this is just a statement, but while you were counting cars at different apartments and with the number of spaces that are there, most places, from what I understand, control the parking spaces. So how are they assigned? Is that, and then are there visitor spaces taking out of that equation as well? So even though there may be, the spots aren't full, maybe it's because just nobody is really allowed to park there, and that other car is someplace else. Is that figure into this?
There's a couple of things. So we have, one of the things that we will be tackling in the coming weeks is visitor parking. Our code doesn't deal with it now, and we have seen a couple examples of projects that provide plenty of parking for their residents but don't provide adequate parking for visitors, and we do want to address that. We do want to make sure that projects above a certain size provide marked visitor spaces so that we aren't creating a situation where we've got enough parking but we aren't using it efficiently. That's absolutely something we're going to tackle.
But then also with the residents themselves, if there's one apartment but 2 spaces have been allocated, maybe that apartment is only allowed 1 space.
So one of the most interesting pieces of research over the past decade has been whether parking is provided for free or not. There is a big difference in car ownership in buildings that provide free spaces with their units to buildings that charge per space. And what the research is showing is that it's called unbundling, charging separately for a unit and a parking space reduces the amount of people that own cars, because there are a lot of people, 112 people here in that building, don't drive to work. They just have a car. Maybe they use it on the weekends, maybe they use it in the evenings, but they don't use it to drive to work. So maybe a good chunk of them don't even need it. And so if they're paying for their parking space, maybe they get rid of it. And so there is a lot of research to that. It's something that we haven't necessarily talked about regulating here in Lakewood, requiring parking spaces to be unbundled, but we could.
Well, one thing, and even though this presentation was eye-opening on how, in the way you explained it, was very informative, but nobody knows that car parked out on the street, on the public street, do they live in that building? So there's a variable there that nobody can tell.
Well, fortunately, one of the nice things about Van Gordon is there's no parking on the street by that building. So we're fairly certain we're able to contain in that particular example, unless they're walking quite a distance, they're parking in the building.
And that would be my next question. How far away are those streets?
Well,
away?
The other example, the other advantage of that building is there's plenty of parking and they're not charging for it. So there's really no reason to park on the street there. So this is a good example of a controlled environment for us to count.
Right. Thank you. Very nice presentation. Thank you.
Councilor Franks?
Thanks. I saw on the original slide it showed that the source data was it from Seattle, Washington? It was like King County Metro or something like that.
They're the ones that did that particular study.
Right. I wanted to know, did we pull any study data from places that can receive the amounts of snow that we can get? Because I do know that if it's uncovered parking and storing that snow until it can melt, generally it's not usually hauled off site. Did we look at any parking requirements for that kind of snow removal activity?
I don't remember looking at requirements with that specifically in mind, but I know that we looked at plenty of places we have lots of Colorado studies, or
Okay.
we had at the time.
Okay, just want to make sure that was factored in. And with regard, did you find any difference between covered and not covered parking as far as differences in parking rates? As far as percentages of because sometimes that drives behavior of a luxury car. You know, if you know something's going to have to sit outside and not. So did you find that drove any behavior as far as number of vehicles?
It drives less. Well, it's hard to say whether it drives behavior of the parkers themselves. What we do know is having structured or requiring structured parking is much more expensive to provide, and so it encourages efficiency and encourages better planning on the developers. If they have to either by regulation or by space constraints have to provide structured parking, they put a lot more thought into how much they need and how it's managed, and so it's used a lot more efficiently.
Great. Did you guys look at any of the data across longer periods of time where you could see economic forces that maybe at certain times in the economy cycles where you have pressure for multi-generational, me and my husband had a townhome in which when we moved in, the parking was fine. We had one assigned space, and then we had one that you kind of had to walk a little, and so we would kind of cycle our cars. But over time, as economics became more problematic for folks, larger numbers of folks, car driving age would be in these, and so you literally ended up where I was walking 2 and 3 blocks to get to my house when I actually had parking, but it was overflow. So did you look at maybe those economic pressures to see how the ebbs and flows might be at different times in economic cycles?
I don't think we really looked at it from that angle. We looked at long term, but I don't think we really got a good sense of up and down patterns, more just a sense of a long-term pattern.
Okay. And did I miss it, or is it literally, it's per unit, it's not per number of bedrooms? There's no mechanism for the size of the units?
So it's interesting. There are cities that do it by size of bed. So I forget the example that we looked at, but it was, 0.6 spaces per studio and 1.1 space per 1 bedroom and 1.5 per 2 bedroom or something. There are cities that do it like that. It's very much the minority. Largely what you'll see is in large buildings you'll have a mix, so it all comes out in the wash in terms of averaging out over time, but it's certainly something that is done and that we could look at.
Yeah, and I would like to consider that maybe for some of the units where they have like dual master suites type of thing, where you're then going to have a different type. You might have more roommate situation, that type of thing. I think we should kind of look at those mixes because we are finding that they are spilling out into our neighborhoods. And so it would be interesting to say if we think that the parking is more than sufficient. And again, many of these are before this particular zoning came into effect, but we are seeing a lot of spillover into the streets. And so I'd be curious whether that was visitor parking, whether that was service vehicles, what that parking overflow looks like. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Harrison.
Yes, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Always interesting to see how this looks. I think I'm going to, rather than asking questions, I'm going to give you my wish list. My wish list is, I think to start with, we should have one parking space per unit at least, and then look at numbers of bedrooms. I think that's another important thing. If we found that those parking spaces aren't being used, then let's allow the developers to put in a pocket park. Take out parking spaces and put in a park. That way, if it's the space isn't being built on for parking lot and they don't need it, at least it's something that their residents can still use. So we start out with enough and can go up, but we're not losing anything, because I think the issue is when they build a huge big building and they don't include enough parking spaces around, there's no solution other than people parking in the neighborhoods. But if there's a little bit of extra there, at least one parking unit per unit, then at least we have a little extra. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing your wish list. Councilor Abel.
Thank you. I I had also wondered, as Ms. Franks had asked, what the parking in King County metro area might have to do with the parking in the Denver metro area. Couldn't we find something closer to home?
We had dozens of studies. That was just the best graphic that I had of the graph.
I would prefer more relevant information than the best graphic. These 112 vehicles that were sitting in the garage during the middle of the day, did we follow up and find out how many of those people work at night?
We did not.
That would seem to be important. As would, what time of night on May 17th did we check Van Garden?
I will find out.
Thank you, because it was early in the evening. Folks might have been at dinner and a movie. In fact, up through midnight. You said in your, and it was a good, bright and brief presentation. I like them that way. You said you would tell us that there's a place on, or how .75 parking spaces is working on the light rail. How's that going?
So far, we don't have any that are that low.
So we don't know.
Yeah, like I said, the market is providing more than it needs.
The market may be providing what it wants. Okay, thank you very much.
So, okay, Councillor Johnson.
Thank you. I'd kind of like to piggyback with Councillor Harrison. I guess I would like to hold the developers' feet to the fire, frankly, and make sure that they are providing adequate parking for their facilities without the expectation that if they don't have enough, they can go into the residential neighborhoods. And if they have extra parking, that's their business on how they want to, what they want to do with that space. We still need to make sure that they are not encroaching outside of their territory, so to speak. And also, too, that the example of 112 parking or cars in the garage, so what? Whether they drive to work or not, I guess the point is if they didn't have a place in a garage, they'd be out on the streets. So I don't care if they drive to work or not, they're still not giving up their cars. Yeah.
Councillor Shakti.
Thank you. I think I had that feeling more when I first came on council and had a bigger learning curve of it's sometimes great to get the data. And we've been all talking about this issue for a long time without a lot of data. It sounds like you guys have done a lot of research and you're also doing more work to collect data and to perfect that system, and that's great. I think we really want to make sure we have adequate parking, and I also think we don't want to have too much parking, because that can be sort of ugly and expensive and pointless. And so figuring out what actually makes sense, and maybe overestimating some, so we're playing it safe, but not too much. I think in that the approach of looking at what's actually happening makes sense. I think to Scott Coop's, Councillor Coop's point, it might make sense to find out what their rules are for parking of the residents when we're counting the units. I think the daytime parking is, both the nighttime and the daytime were very interesting. The daytime, I mean, there's complexities there.
But to the extent that it shows people are working nearby, that's relevant to where we allow housing to be built and how that will affect traffic. So that's part of its relevance. And it was heartening, particularly after we heard that parts of the light rail don't have as high ridership as we might hope, to hear that people are in fact using cars less and using other modes more in some situations is great to hear. I also wonder about, so we talk about these problem areas, and I don't really know where the problem areas are that are not in Ward 3, but I'm familiar with one in Ward 3. And maybe if we could, so in addition to looking at new constructions and what we're actually seeing happen with parking there, we could look at the problem areas and what are their parking counts. And so I know that in the Ward 3 example, the issue is not that they don't have enough parking, it's that the way they're using it, but how much, what is the parking they're allocating to their residents, and so what is not enough in that situation? And I assume from you said we're going to look at the way parking spaces are used, I assume that means we're going to be talking about the Ward 3 specific example moving forward, so thank you.
So I'll follow up with your colleague from Ward 3, Council President Roy Ball.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a couple follow-up questions for you. On an average residential house, how many cars are permitted for a house? Just curious, about 7?
Permitted or required?
Is it 7?
Yeah, I think you can park 7 outside.
Yeah. And then maybe 3 on the driveway or something?
Yeah, so we don't have a good maximum for single-family homes.
A lot of the things that we've been exhibiting, and this is kind of, we had talked about new development and, the vehicles, how many potential are there. I wanted to bring to light what's already pre-existing, what's there, and how we can help manage the vehicles. For example, if you have another entity that is just right underneath the city and dictating, like a HOA, saying, hey, we don't want commercial vehicles like a van or a name on a vehicle parked on our property. You can park it outside your property. If you park it on ours, we'll tow you. I think it's and when they put it on the right-of-way or in the other residential parking, we have 2 residents that are going at it back and forth. So it puts us in a lose-lose situation. And, Councilor Harrison said, I have a wish list. Well, I want to echo that just a little bit more and kind of mention that maybe we can take a look at that, situation about we do have existing parking that does meet the criteria, but an HOA comes up and they say, well, we don't like the way our HOA looks like. You can park outside the HOA and you can park your commercial vehicles and all that. I'd like to see if we can take a look at an ordinance or something and saying, guys, take your vehicles, put them back on your property. Please don't, push them out. It's your tenants or your owners. You deal with them. So that's my wish list. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you. Councilor Vincent.
Quick question. What were the 2 addresses that were in the TOD that you already had the data on? Do you have those? Could I get it?
The large one was the Oak Street Apartments at 14th and Oak.
Okay.
I don't remember off the top of my head the smaller one, the 15-unit one, but I can send that information to you if you'd like.
That'd be great. And there's more, obviously, that have come on now. Will that be part of the next study? Or maybe I should ask, where do you consider around the stations?
So these are zones that end in a T, so MGT, MST, the transit context.
Okay.
And I don't know off the top of my head if there are more underway right now or in planning in transit context.
Well, wouldn't the ones around Lamar station count?
Indeed.
The 3 that are there?
Yep, I think they probably would.
Okay. If we could incorporate some of that data, that'd be great, because I think that'd give us a few more points.
As they come online, we'll do that.
Perfect. Thank you.
And I think Westline coming on board right now, I think they're parked at like 1.8, 1.9. I may be off, but that's...
I'll find out.
Yeah, at Lamar, Metro West. Yeah.
I've got the data.
Councillor Gutwein.
Thank you. So a couple questions. One of the early slides had something about CBD. What is CBD?
Central Business District. It's downtown.
Okay. Thank you. And then was there any research about bike parking, and if developers are required to have bike parking, if that changes the behavior? And
that's a great question. We did start requiring bike parking in 2012. Our new code requires bike parking for residents of multifamily buildings, I think at one space for every 2 units. So a 300-unit building has to have 150 bike locker or a room that can accommodate 150 bike spaces. But we don't yet have any good data. We can't draw a correlation between that and lower parking rates necessarily, although we could start counting usage of those.
I was just going to say, was Van Gordon built?
Yes.
And has that? So I would be interested if we did another count, if we did a bike count as well, to see if they are riding their bikes.
We can do that.
Thank you. Okay. So then my other question is, kind of along having that flexible range of parking spaces. So in Ward 5, we have a project in process where the residents would actually like to see, or some of the residents in the neighborhood surrounding would like to see lower parking requirements for that multifamily, because it would have then allowed the unit to be smaller and get rid of some of the covered parking spaces. But that wasn't a possibility because the bank funding required a certain amount of parking spaces in order to fund this project. So I was wondering if you could provide a little context about how the banks fit into this and their requirements around parking and all of that.
So, and that is another perhaps distinction between the smaller projects and the larger projects. The bigger your project, the more money you're borrowing. And the banks that are loaning money to these projects make the rules. If they're looking at projects in another city that were parked at 2 spaces per unit and they think that's what it takes to be successful, they say, we'll only loan you money if you build at 2 spaces per unit. And so we see a lot of that projects actually build more parking than the developers want to, and the primary reason is the funding.
And more than our code would require.
Definitely.
Is what you're saying. Okay.
Definitely.
Okay. Thank you. That is really helpful. And then I'm going to add a wish list item, since that's apparently what we're doing tonight. Is to look into if other cities have tried having a partnership with their public transit to offer discounted passes to residents to further encourage people to not drive, and if those were successful, similar with having ride-sharing parking spaces. And then finally, I just wanted to comment that I really appreciate getting the data into this conversation, because it helps take some of the question out, and I think there is a lot of taking emotion out of a conversation when we can look at numbers and see what's really happening. And on that note, I look forward to seeing if the trend at Van Gordon continues over time, and I think it will be helpful to have more of these case studies and looking at different times of day and that kind of question. So in other words, thank you for the work.
Councilor Wickman?
Going back to the example that you gave earlier, what was that address on Van Gordon?
35 Van Gordon, I believe.
Or 35, okay. And is that parking there free, or do they have to pay for it?
I believe it's free.
Okay. Well, the reason I ask is I don't know myself, but I've received information that there may be charges for that. And also the same thing for that new building at 85 South Union. And, if you're charging a significant amount of money, then that, kind of changes the dynamics a little bit. So you might want to look into that. I did want to echo what Councilor Franks mentioned earlier. I know I'm repeating myself, but I had the experience when I was a young man of living in a condo up there in Union Square. And one of the things I found is they were selling it to me because I was a single person. Well, as time went by, I moved out, and next thing you know, it got replaced with families of 4, 5, 6, whatever, in the same size unit. And, of course, the parking got to be out of control. And another example that comes to mind, we talked about, assisted living, doesn't really need a lot of parking. Well, we know in our zoning code that we don't say that it has to be assisted living. They may be building assisted living, and there may be assisted living, but 10, 20, 30 years down the road, that may no longer be the case. They may sell it, and we'd have, whatever there. And then finally, for my wish list, I wish I could have chocolate and not gain weight. Thank you.
We'll take that to the Planning Commission. I'll throw pizza out for me. Councilor Shakti.
I want to agree with Councilor Royball's point about work trucks, the rules about work trucks. I do think that ends up being an issue. I don't know exactly what we can do about it, but we should look into it. And then another issue I see is sometimes by apartments when you have garages, they're used for storage, not parking. I don't really know what we can do about that, but it affects the parking count some. And then the bike parking, I think it's great to check use of bike parking, partly to see if people are riding their bikes, but partly to see if that's enough and if we need more at some point. The other thing that came to mind about the bike parking is I was sort of surprised to hear in one of these developments, people were saying they didn't want to see balconies on the apartments. And I actually love balconies. I like looking at them. They make me imagine being on a balcony. But their concern was the stuff on the balconies. And I think in my memories of living in apartments, it's often the bike that ends up on the balcony because you don't know where to put it. So it could help with that situation too. Thanks.
Councilor Abel.
There was some talk about other types of parking, restaurants, and that sort of thing in your presentation. Do we want to get into that tonight, or do we want to look at that as a larger part of the larger issue in other parts of town? Mayor?
My preference would be a larger issue, but...
No, that's fine with me. We got a lot to talk about there, too. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Councilor Franks.
Just wanted to add that I looked up the apartment complex at 35 Van Gordon, and it's a nominal fee. It looks like the first space is like between $20 and $25 a month, and additional space is $40. So it's nominal. So it's not a high dollar fee, but they do seem to charge for parking.
Thank you for that.
All right. Well, great. And I'm sure as we start to roll out, there's going to be a website and this sort of stuff. I hope that we can get on that as the Planning Commission starts to take charge. And I think it's also important to know it's kind of a snapshot, like a point in night. So, we weren't looking for, it was just trying to give some examples tonight and not the hard and fast data. Much like when they go out and kind of count our folks on the streets, it's a one-night deal. So it will be interesting to see how it progresses and what we see, as well as with what comes on at 85, to see what the correlation between that and St. Anthony is and some of the other medical office buildings over there. So thank you very much. I appreciate the conversation, and it is really good to help us start thinking as a group of where we're going to go or how we need to go. All right. So, executive report, Ms. Neal.
No report.
All right. Couple things that I have are a few years ago we started the Lakewood Faith Coalition, which was really trying to bring all of our faith-based communities together to figure out how they can concentrate on certain things and be strategic and really help the community out. So the second phase to that has been our service organizations, and that's the Kiwanis, Elks, Rotary, Optimus. And they had their first kind of mini project on Saturday at Rose Stein Elementary, and they came together to do some planting, some flowers, things, aesthetics to that, as well as providing some instruments, some band equipment for the kids. So it was a great first step. I want to thank all the folks that went out and were a part of that. We look forward to this continuing to grow. And if you're looking for a way to give back in the community, these folks, these different organizations are always looking for membership. Right, Margie? Yeah, or David? So it's a great opportunity to give back, and they do so many wonderful things. Second thing I'll touch on, I think other counselors will, was the third annual Mural Fest, another great success. And this year they had a trolley, in addition to the festival, that took folks out and actually showed them. There's, I think, over 30 murals now in the 40 West Arts District, and they stopped at around 18 or 19 of them. So that was really nice, and it actually was packed with people waiting to get on, and ran throughout the day. Congratulations to our police department, who got a Gold Standard Accreditation Award, one of very few, I guess, in the whole nation that has received it as many times as the city of Lakewood has. So congratulations to them for all of their hard work. Mayor Pro Tem Harrison.
No report.
Council President Roybal.
No report.
Shakti.
No report.
Councilmember Johnson.
Ward 1 will not be having a ward meeting in September. We'll resume again in September, not in August, I'm sorry. Right?
No, October, not
October. Okay, we won't have one in September. We'll have it in October.
Councilor Abel.
Thank you, Mayor. The Yard House Restaurant reopened Friday. It's out at Mills Mall. We appreciate the faith they have in Lakewood and the service they give to us. Please, as folks reopen at the mall, please go out there and patronize them. Have a good meal at Yard House. Just don't stick me with the ticket. Thank you.
And if I'm going to add to that real quick, there was a cool story that we heard. While they were shut down, the management and their employees went out into the community and gave over 1,200 hours of community service to some of our local nonprofits. So you can imagine what they were dealing with, being closed down, not having work. They took the time to give back, so it's really special. It's very cool. Councilor Vincent?
Yes, I just want to say something about Mural Fest, too. It was absolutely wonderful, and a lot of people out there put in a lot of hours and a lot of hard work. It was very good, and I want to give a shout-out to the ICSC, too, because they're a facility that are in our neighborhood, and they sent over just, I think, like 15 people in the morning that just got everything done like that. And then they sent people back out in the evening. And it was a really nice experience. And we got to interact with them, and they gave quite a bit of help for that. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Franks?
Well, first and foremost, wanted to thank Ward 4 for good turnout for our last meeting, as always. And also something that I've been trying to encourage more folks to get involved in city government. And I am just so pleased that this year's 2017 Citizens Planning Academy, we had more participants than could fit in. And so we're going to have to wait list and put some folks on next year. And what I would encourage folks out there listening here in our audience and listening from home, if you are at all interested, just go ahead and express that interest, because I would like to see that class size doubled next year. It's just encouraging to see all the folks who are really wanting to understand how planning works and our civics class and all those different things that we offer. So please take advantage of that. Don't think that just because it filled up that you shouldn't express your interest, so we can get those class sizes appropriately sized for years to come. Thanks.
Councilor Gutwein.
Thanks. I just want to take a moment, because I let the opportunity pass by earlier when we were talking about the events over the weekend, and to thank those of you who made a statement about it, and to just add that, I too have been heartsick over this, and it's hard to believe that we could face something like this in this day and age. So my family, my father's side of the family is Jewish, and we were raised to always know that we are not better than or less than, we are equal. And I think that's why the meaning on this sign, that we are building an inclusive community, means so much to me. And I just want to add my voice that I also send my sympathies and don't condone that kind of bigotry and hatred. And it's not welcome in Lakewood. So thank you.
Councilor Wickman.
I didn't hear anybody mention Cops Cook breakfast this Friday.
Cops cook breakfast.
Well, cops that cook, and I think they're cooking breakfast. There we go. I make it up as I go along. From 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. this Friday at the Clemens Community Center, 1580 Yarrow Street. Proceeds are going to benefit seniors in need in the community. And also that same day from 4 to 7 in the afternoon is the Party on the Plaza. I think I said that correctly. That's also free, and that's here at 480 South Allison, involving music, food, circus performers, cash bar with beer and wine. Okay, there we go. So anyway, a couple events on Friday.
Councilor Coop, nothing. Ms. Greer? All right. Well, I want to thank you all. Troop 808, you guys stayed the whole meeting. I think you're the only troop and the largest troop that's ever done that. So that's a new record. Thank you. All right. We will adjourn at 8:36 p.m.